All right, so today we're diving deep into a world where democracy and authoritarianism are like clashing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and we're looking at a transcript from this YouTube channel called What's Going On channel,
Okay.
and they have some pretty strong opinions about Trump, Putin, and the whole situation in Ukraine.
I see.
It's not just some theoretical debate. This is impacting real people, not just in Ukraine, but globally.
Right. Yeah, the stakes are high.
Yeah, really high. And it could even, potentially impact your own safety and security.
Absolutely.
So this source really frames this whole thing as this this choice between democracy and authoritarianism. And they don't really leave a lot of room for nuance.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It sounds like they're arguing that Trump's admiration for strongman leaders could actually ripple out and impact American foreign policy.
Yeah.
And that could, weaken alliances with democratic nations and embolden these authoritarian regimes.
Exactly. And they make some pretty bold claims. For example, they point to Trump's statement. I think he said that Ukraine actually started the war. And they use this as proof that he's aligning himself with Putin and even prefers authoritarians over democratic allies.
Well, that's where we need to be careful about separating fact from opinion, right?
Sure.
Because, Trump may have made statements that sound sympathetic to Putin.
Yeah.
But the idea that Ukraine started the war, that's just demonstrably false.
Yeah, for sure.
Russia invaded Crimea back in 2014, annexed it, and then launched the full-scale invasion in 2022.
Right, and they're still occupying a huge chunk of Ukraine.
Exactly.
So I get that the source is trying to make a point, but overlooking those facts,
yeah,
it feels like a pretty big leap.
Yeah, it does.
They also spent a lot of time highlighting the human cost of the conflict, talking about over 1 million casualties, the ongoing missile strikes, civilian massacres, and even the kidnapping of Ukrainian children.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really awful. And they even mentioned the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for Putin,
right,
labeling him a war criminal.
Yeah, the source is absolutely right to shine a light on the reality of what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah.
This is a devastating conflict with very real consequences for millions of people.
For sure.
And they use that, they try to use that to kind of strengthen their argument about Trump being pro-authoritarian. They call out specific things he said about Ukraine and Zelensky.
Yeah, like that Zelensky's a dictator.
Exactly.
But then they immediately counter that by reminding us that Zelensky was, democratically elected with 75% of the vote.
Yeah.
And he has really high approval ratings, even with the war going on.
That's right. They also highlight the fact that the Ukrainian parliament is still functioning.
Yeah.
And there's active political debate,
Right.
Even with this huge threat looming over them, it directly challenges that whole narrative of Ukraine as this authoritarian state.
Right, which seems like a big part of their argument.
Yeah.
It almost feels like they're trying to build this case that Trump's whole worldview is at odds with, American values and interests. Like they're saying he's undermining democracy, not just in America, but globally.
Yeah. And they even go as far as to say that he admires Putin's regime.
Right.
Which is, it's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, it is.
So to even begin to understand that argument, we need to look closer at how they're characterizing, Putin's Russia,
Okay.
They paint this picture of Putin as someone who's, consolidated his power by striking a deal with these oligarchs. He gives them absolute power.
Right.
And in exchange, they can exploit the Russian people.
So they're basically saying that ordinary Russians are struggling while these oligarchs are hoarding trillions of dollars.
Yeah, in offshore accounts and stuff.
Yeah.
It's a system built on corruption, inequality.
Right.
And the source seems to be drawing this parallel. They're suggesting that Trump sees the system.
Yeah.
And maybe even admires it. Perhaps even sees it as a model for how he'd like to rule.
It's a pretty serious accusation to make.
It is.
I do wonder, though, by focusing just on the Putin for the oligarchs thing, aren't we kind of oversimplifying the situation?
That's a really great question.
Yeah.
And it's an important one to consider because while the source really focuses on the financial side of things,
right,
there are definitely other factors at play.
Like what?
Well, the control of information, right? The media, that plays a huge role in shaping public perception.
Yeah.
And how Putin maintains his power.
For sure. And
speaking of controlling information, this source also brings up the case of Alexei Navalny.
Right, the opposition leader.
Yeah, who was poisoned, and then, they threw him in prison when he came back to Russia.
It's pretty crazy.
They're using Navalny's situation as this stark example of how Putin silences dissent. It's a tactic straight out of the authoritarian playbook.
Yeah.
Silence anyone who speaks out against you.
And then they go on to mention the mass exodus of Russians fleeing the country.
Right.
Since the invasion of Ukraine. It's like a really grim picture they're painting of life under Putin.
It does make you wonder, about how effective that kind of iron fist approach to leadership really is in the long run.
Right.
Because this source seems to be saying that Trump being buddy-buddy with Putin is like this fundamental threat to democratic values, not just in the U.S., but all over the world.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
Yeah, it is.
So what I'm hearing is that this source is drawing a very clear line between Trump's actions and this idea of a global shift towards authoritarianism.
Yeah, and they're using the war in Ukraine as like this key example, this case study almost.
Right, to illustrate that point.
Exactly.
So I guess to really understand their argument, we need to delve deeper into what they're saying about the nature of authoritarianism.
Yes.
And the threats it poses to democracy.
Exactly. Let's do that.
It's interesting because on the one hand, they're really emphasizing these traditional American values, freedom of speech, democracy.
Right.
But then they're saying that Trump is actually undermining those very values.
Yeah, it's that contrast that's really at the heart of their argument.
Okay.
They're directly connecting, Trump's actions, his rhetoric, to this erosion of democratic principles, both here and abroad.
That's a pretty heavy accusation to make. Do they offer any specific examples to back that up?
Well, they bring up the claim that European allies haven't done enough to support Ukraine.
Right.
And they suggest that, that's somehow because of Trump, that he's weakened those alliances.
Right.
But then they immediately turn around and say, well, actually, Europe has given more aid to Ukraine than the U.S. has.
So they're kind of using facts to debunk a claim that actually supports their own narrative.
Yeah.
That's an interesting strategy.
It is.
It still feels like they're jumping around a lot, though, between the different parts of the conflict.
Yeah.
And then Trump's, alleged involvement.
I see what you mean. Maybe if we connect this back to the broader themes, democracy versus authoritarianism, it might make more sense. Remember, the source is ultimately arguing that Trump's worldview is much more aligned with authoritarianism than with democratic principles.
Right. And they're using the conflict in Ukraine and Trump's response to it as a case study, I guess.
Exactly, to kind of illustrate that point.
Okay. So to understand that argument, we need to look closer at what they're saying about the nature of authoritarianism.
Yes.
And what makes it so dangerous to democracy.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. What are they highlighting as the defining characteristics of authoritarianism?
Well, they point to things like the suppression of dissent, controlling information, and using violence and intimidation to hold on to power. Classic tactics of authoritarian regimes.
And we've seen those tactics in action, not just in Russia,
right,
but in other countries with authoritarian leaders as well.
Exactly.
It's definitely a concerning trend.
Yeah, and the source seems to be suggesting that these aren't just isolated incidents. It's like a pattern, this global shift towards authoritarianism.
And that Trump is somehow, aiding and abetting that shift.
That's what they're claiming. It's like they're presenting it as this battle between two opposing worldviews with democracy hanging in the balance.
It's interesting because this whole discussion about authoritarianism and democracy, it's happening against this backdrop of this very real war in Ukraine with all its complexities and nuances.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the whole issue of propaganda and misinformation.
Right. They said that years of continuous propaganda and billions pumped it looks that Putin is going to win over.
Right. That really stood out to me, too.
Yeah.
Because it raises these important questions about, how does propaganda actually work?
Yeah.
How effective is it? And how can we recognize it? How can we resist it?
It's a real challenge.
It is.
Especially nowadays,
Yeah.
We're bombarded with information from all sides.
All the time.
How do we even sift through all the noise and figure out what's actually true?
That's the million-dollar question, and I think that's one of the key takeaways from this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
Whether or not you agree with this source's conclusions, they're making us confront this very real threat of misinformation.
For sure.
And how it can be used to manipulate us, to control us.
And it really highlights the importance of critical thinking and media literacy, right?
Absolutely.
We have to be able to evaluate information, look for biases, and think for ourselves.
Because if we don't, we risk being swayed by propaganda, whether it's coming from a foreign government or even our own.
This whole discussion about the conflict and propaganda.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something I read about the way algorithms shape our online experience.
Oh, interesting.
The algorithms that decide what we see on social media, on search engines.
Right.
They can create these filter bubbles that basically just reinforce what we already believe.
Yeah, yeah.
And make it harder to even encounter different viewpoints.
Exactly. It's like the information landscape itself is becoming more complex.
Right.
And maybe even more susceptible to manipulation.
So what can we even do about that? As individuals, I mean, how can we protect ourselves from being misled?
Well, one of the most important things is to diversify our sources of information.
Okay.
Don't just rely on one news outlet or just one social media platform.
Right, right.
Actively seek out different perspectives, even ones you disagree with.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's super important to check the credibility of your sources.
Yeah.
You know, who's behind the information you're reading or watching?
Right.
What's their agenda?
It's almost like we need to develop like an information hygiene routine.
I like that.
You know, like we brush our teeth, wash our hands. We need to develop habits to keep our minds healthy, too.
Yeah, good information hygiene.
Right. It's about being proactive, critical.
Exactly.
In how we consume information.
I think this deep dive has really made me think about the way I consume information.
Me too.
And how easy it is to get caught up in a narrative without even realizing it.
Yeah, and this source is definitely trying to present a very specific narrative.
For sure.
They're painting Trump as a threat to democracy.
Right.
And Putin as this, like, master manipulator. And whether or not you buy into that narrative.
Right.
It's important to be aware of the tactics they're using to construct it.
Yeah, absolutely.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
This source has given us a lot to think about.
Yeah, a lot to unpack for sure.
You know, their claims about Trump, like his intentions and motivations, those are definitely debatable.
Right.
But they raise some really important questions.
They do.
About leadership, about how fragile democracy really is, and about the ways propaganda can shape our view of the world.
Yeah, and it's insidious, you know? You don't always realize it's happening.
I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that we can't just passively consume information.
Right.
We have to be active.
Yeah.
Critical thinkers, constantly questioning, you know.
Question everything, right.
Exactly. What are we being told and why?
Absolutely. And that means being willing to, you know, step outside of our comfort zones a little bit,
right.
Engage with viewpoints that are different from our own,
yeah.
And challenge our own assumptions.
It's not always easy, though.
No, it's not.
Especially when we're constantly surrounded by information that, you know, just confirms what we already believe.
Yeah, it's comfortable, right?
Right, but it's crucial.
It is.
If we want to be informed citizens and make good decisions.
You know, and it's important to remember that we're all part of this information ecosystem.
Okay.
You know, the choices we make about what we read, what we watch, what we share online.
Yeah.
It all has an impact, you know? It ripples out.
That's a powerful goal.
It is.
We have a responsibility.
We do.
Not just to ourselves, but to each other.
Yeah.
To be careful about the information we consume and share.
And as we wrap up here, I'd like to leave our listeners with a final question to ponder.
Okay.
Remember, the source said years of continuous propaganda and billions pumped at looks that Putin is going to win over. What do you think? What factors contribute to the success or failure of propaganda, especially in a globalized world like ours?
That's such a good question.
It is.
And I think we could spend hours talking about it.
We probably could.
But for now, I think the biggest takeaway is to stay curious.
Yes.
Stay skeptical.
Question everything.
And stay engaged.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of, well, the issues that matter.
Looking forward to it.